Alright, I know we've just met and the few of you guys that are here barely know me, but this isn't usually the type of game I would normally play. Not saying I'm against trying new things, it's just when you're an unemployed, broke college student, you kinda have to use the little bit of spending money that you have very wisely, which usually leads me not to take much risk and play games that I'm comfortable with. Basically, I'm a basic bitch gamer, but something about this game really caught my eye. I don't know if it was the art style, the fact the gameplay reminded me a little bit of Jak and Daxter, or hell, maybe it was because of the bright and pretty colors. But something about this game really piqued my curiosity and made me want to give it a try. And spoiler warning, I'm glad I did. But let me not get ahead of myself here. Kena Bridge of Spirits is an action-adventure game, which is a genre so broad and undefined that it includes games like Bioshock, God of War, and fucking Minecraft. But that's a problem for another day. Like most games of this genre, Kena's main gameplay loop is broken up between combat arenas, light platforming, and most importantly, exploration, as Kena has a light collectathon element in the form of the rod. But before I get in too deep about the gameplay mechanics, I should probably touch upon the story. You play as the titular character Kena, who is a young spirit guide making her way to the mountain shrine, where she runs into a mysterious spirit who, much like a southern farmer, is very unhappy with you trespassing on his property. We then learn that this spirit has control over corruption. Now, what is corruption, you might ask? Great question, but I don't really know. The game never actually explains where it comes from or how it's created, yet it's basically the central antagonist of the entire game. After running into Mystery Mask, you enter a clearing where you meet Benny and Saya, two young spirits. But most importantly, you find your first collection of rot. You soon find out that these creatures have a special relationship with corruption, being that they are able to weaken corruption spores for Kena to destroy, which opens up previously blockaded areas. They are also able to bind enemies, giving you an opening to attack. We also see that Kena's hand has this weird mark on it that glows when she touches the rot and seems to give her some type of discomfort. Obviously, it's foreshadowing for something, right? Right? But anyway, after running into the masked man one more time and beating the tutorial boss, Benny and Saya offer to show you the way up to the mountain shrine, under the condition that you help their brother who's been trapped by the corruption. They then take you to Heiko, their home village and hub area, where you meet the mask maker, who tells you that if you want to make it to the mountain shrine, you have to help the spirits around the village find peace. The opening section of the game serves two purposes. One, setting up Kena's main goal, which gameplay is centered around, helping the spirits around the village, and the second being explaining the importance of the rot. These cute little bastards function not only as glorified farming tools as they interact with, pick up, and move objects in the environment, opening new areas for exploration, and help earn currency to upgrade and purchase items with, but most importantly, they are directly tied to Kena's overall level. The more rot you collect increases Kena's power by giving her access to more powerful moves. But I use the words more and powerful very loosely. Looser than a porn star's cooter. And I guess now would be the best time to touch upon the gameplay. Like I said before, Kena's gameplay loop is broken up into three core pillars, the first being exploration, as you will be searching through dense and beautiful areas, not only for relics, personal items that once belonged to the spirit that you are helping, but for the rot as well. You accomplish this through platforming, the second pillar of Kena's gameplay, which I would argue is the weakest. Unlike traditional platformers where you unlock moves and abilities that expand upon the base platforming mechanics, allowing you to reach places otherwise unreachable and changing your approach to platforming challenges entirely, Kena doesn't have any of that. Kena doesn't have or unlock any abilities that impact the core platforming, except for one that I'll get into later. And even then I barely count it because it doesn't change how you approach platforming at all. Instead, Kena decides to opt into Uncharted brand platforming, i.e. a lot of handheld climbing sections that have the same level of satisfaction as running your dick through a cheese grater. So, none at all. Unfortunately, this is how the game chooses for you to find the many different rot, and this is where the light collectathon elements come in. I say light because unlike other games of that genre, the collectibles that you have to find are not used to progress through the game, so games like Mario and Jak and Daxter, where a certain amount of the collectible is needed to move on. Here, although you find some of the rot naturally through exploration, the game straight up hands you rot for finding relics, beating bosses, and clearing areas of corruption. Which leads us to combat. Unlike other action games where you can find enemies naturally throughout the world to run fades with, enemies are tied to corruption spores, excluding a few exceptions. These essentially function as combat arenas where you fight off manifestations of corruption, which is a bit of a bad thing because if you wander too far away from the spore, enemies will despawn and when you get back in the area they will respawn with full health like nothing ever happened. Like most third-person action games, Kena's combat consists of light and heavy attacks that you chain together to make combos. And by combos, I mean the one light light heavy, light light light, and heavy 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 string. I hope you see what I'm getting at, that although enjoyable, Kena's combat is pretty fucking bare bones. So bare it's giving the Mojave a run for its money. Other than the spirit bow ability you unlock towards the beginning of the game and a bomb ability you get in the middle, there's no other ability you get that changes the way you engage in combat. I even struggle to call the bomb ability a combat ability because its primary use is to activate platforms in the environment for traversal. And although it can be used in combat, it feels very stilted and awkward to use. But hey, that could be because I have the coordination of a panda climbing a tree. The only other thing that changes combat would be courage, a limited use resource that is built up through combat. This resource not only allows Kenna to directly use the rod by binding and holding enemies in place, doing damage and giving you an opening to attack, but also imbuing the rod into some of her attacks, empowering them. Although this sounds great and that it adds another layer to combat, unfortunately I can't say it does, cause Kenna only gets 3 of these special rod moves: Rod Hammer, Rod Arrow, and Rod Bomb. Rod Hammer and Arrow are your main source of heavy damage, as Kenna's normal attacks have the effectiveness of a stepdad punishing their stepkids, meaning you think you're doing something, but their action says otherwise. The Rod Bomb, however, is where things get a little interesting, as it does no direct damage to enemies, but freezes enemies in place. As for defense, Kenna has a dodge, block, and parry. The dodge is your standard third-person action game dodge, but the block and parry are where things get a little less stale. Kenna's block is a bubble that protects her from all directions, which sounds broken, but to circumvent that, her block has a health bar, and when depleted it not only knocks her on her ass, but it also keeps her from blocking or parrying till it comes back. As for the parry, it seems like your stereotypical parry that you do by blocking just before an enemy hits you, till you remember that Kenna's block covers her whole body, meaning that Kenna's parry is technically omnidirectional. I say technically since I don't think it was intended, because anytime you unintentionally parry an enemy who isn't directly in front of you, the camera whips itself to the enemy, and as you can imagine, that's extremely fucking jarring. I can't emphasize enough how annoying it is to have to reorientate yourself mid-combat because you accidentally parried an enemy that you couldn't see on your fucking screen, which honestly led me to rely very little on it. Speaking of enemies, the variety of them is fine, although their design is basically just choose your favorite flavor of stickman. Although there are many different types of enemies, they never really require any different approach other than hit them with stick till dead. The only enemies that force you to change your approach are these turtle-like enemies that need to be opened up with your bomb to expose their weak points, and the spirit warriors, who are invulnerable until you either parry them or hit them with a dash attack. Which is something I forgot to mention because you get it in the last 1/4 of the game, and it takes away from your block gauge when you use it and doesn't really provide you with much utility that warrants you using it. But yeah, there's a dash attack. But anyway, back to what I was saying about the encounters with the spirit warriors, they're so few and far between that I could probably count them on one hand. Probably. But I'm not going to. Which is why I struggle to say they change your overall approach to combat. That all shifts, however, when we get to boss fights. Kenna has 16 bosses in total, whose quality varies like a college student's will to live. While none are outright terrible, many of the bosses don't leave any lasting impressions. Kenna also takes the route of some bosses becoming normal enemies that you encounter, which isn't inherently a bad thing, since it's a good way to gauge player and character skill growth. But in a game with few standout bosses, it's not doing itself any favors. Kenna has 2 types of bosses, one being bosses that are found throughout the world, usually guarding new areas or relics. That's all I'm going to say about them because they're not horrendously bad, but they're so middling that I don't want to take the time to talk about them. The second being the corrupted spirit of the villager you are trying to help. And these bosses seem to have gotten the biggest slice of the design pie. Not only do these bosses actually have plot significance, they also have the most thought put into their design and moveset. Corrupted spirit bosses take up the attributes that the spirit had in their life by having their relic directly integrated into the fight. A perfect example of this would be Adira. Adira is the woodsmith of the village who built multiple structures around the village to channel spirit energy, this mainly being the village heart. In her boss fight, the village heart is tied directly into the fight by being a defense for Adira that you have to destroy to do damage to her. Also, during the fight, she will not only repair the heart, giving her back her damage immunity, but she will also use it to create bursts of energies to attack you. This is an excellent way of using backstory of a boss to directly impact their mechanics. But hey, maybe my standards are so low that I'm easily impressed. The rest of the plot significant bosses tend to follow this trend. Well, that is up until we get to the final boss. After Kenna helps free Taro and Adira, she then begins her ascent back to the mountain shrine, where she again runs into the masked man, who we find out is the village leader, Toshi, which should be a surprise to no one since he outright says it at the beginning of the game. Kenna then confronts him, but due to an inner turmoil inside of her, she easily becomes overwhelmed and is pushed into the spirit realm, where we learn that her father died when she was a child and was left to fend for herself. And that's the reason that she became a spirit guide and why she's helping the spirits in the village, not only to help them find peace, but to hopefully make her dad proud. which almost warms my cold dead heart. After coming to terms with and ultimately resolving her inner turmoil, Kenna must enter the spirit realm to find Toshi's relics to be able to face him. This process is slightly different from the other spirits because 1, the relics are actually part of Toshi's personality, and 2, instead of being guarded by random bosses, you have to fight this part of Toshi to receive the relic. These bosses are Hunter, Mask Maker, and Warrior, and are some of the best and hardest bosses in the game, requiring you to use almost every skill you've learned so far. Well, all except for Warrior, who was so dull and forgettable that I beat him on my first try and my mind completely blocked out all memory of even fighting him. Anyway, after fighting and receiving all of Toshi's relics, you go once more to face him in a boss fight that incorporates all of his relics abilities, pushing you to use every skill and ability you and the rod have learned, and although cheap at certain points, is a satisfying and well put together encounter that should have been the final boss. But unfortunately, it isn't. After beating the brakes off Toshi, he uses his power to put the rot in a genjutsu, causing them to abandon Kenna and go further up the mountain to the mountain shrine. When you reach them, Toshi corrupts the power of the shrine and uses it to combine the rot into a corrupted version of their original form. This is the actual final boss. A big, dumb, mostly invulnerable enemy that just spews shit at you like a college professor giving information the day before the exam. The only way to damage it is by using arrows to target its weak points. Oh, did I mention that you don't have any rod abilities? And the only way to get them is by damaging the rod god enough to where it teleports you to a room where you have to free the rod by A, either having to fight off waves of enemies, B, do a platforming challenge, or C, a combination of the two. You do this 3 times, and on the 3rd, not only do you have to dodge this projectile bullshit that gets turned up to 100, but you have to deal with endlessly spawning ads and gather enough rod actions to damage the arrows sticking out of its back to finally beat it. Look, to all aspiring game developers that just happened to come across this video, just because you threw everything at the wall and some of the shit stuck doesn't equate to good boss design. Look, I cannot stress how this fight, although not too difficult or completely terrible, infuriated me because they already had an almost perfect boss fight literally 5 minutes before. That it almost lessens the entire experience and ending for me. Almost. After beating the final boss and freeing all the rot, you learn that when the rot arrived, it brought with it a famine that decimated the village, killing many of the villagers. Toshi, as a village leader, feels responsible for this and takes it upon himself to save the village. Assuming the rot god is to blame, Toshi, using the power of corruption, confronts and ultimately kills the rot god, separating it into the rot that you collected throughout the game. Kenna and the Mask Maker help Toshi deal with his grief of failing the village and ultimately find peace, allowing Kenna to commune with the mountain shrine to restore the rot god and heal the land, bringing Kenna's journey to an end. Now, although this is the end of the game, it left me with more questions than when I began. Like, where does corruption come from and what causes it? What are the rot and what are their purpose in the context of the story? Are spirit guides the only one that can use spirit energy? Or can everyone use it since so many structures in the village require it to work? If not, what makes a spirit guide special compared to the other people, and can anyone be one? If yes, then how the fuck did people use the structures in the village? What was the mark on Kenna's arm that the game kept pointing out? Does every spirit guide have it? If not, why the fuck did the game keep pointing it out if it wasn't gonna go anywhere? And the list goes on. But after sitting on it for a while, I realized that wasn't really the point of the story. Throughout the entire game, Kenna's whole mission is to help spirits move on and leave this realm. And that's the story the game's trying to tell. How to deal with grief and how to leave the past behind and move on, not letting the grief of losing someone or something you love corrupt your life. This game nails these themes right on the head. I just wish it didn't have to sacrifice on expanding the world to do so. All in all, though I've been very critical of the game throughout this video, I can confidently say that I highly recommend it. Despite its flaws, it's an extremely charming, fun, and heart-filled game, and with it being my first indie I've played, it has really opened my eyes to what this genre can do and the stories that they can tell. And honestly, I can't wait to dive into them more.